Hello everybody, and welcome to our Digital Literary Arts class conversations. This is our 10th conversation, I think, and we're very happy to have JR Carpenter with us today. So thank you. Hi.
Hi,
Hello.
JR.
Hi.
Thank you
So
for being here.
My pleasure.
thank you so much. We're gonna do the usual. Élika will read a short bio introducing our excellent speaker today, in case you're not familiar with her work, and we'll just jump right into some questions.
All right. So, JR Carpenter is a UK-based artist, writer, performer, and researcher working across performance, print, and digital media. Her pioneering web-based works have been presented in museums, galleries, and festivals around the world. She is a winner of the CBC Quebec Writing Competition, the QWF Carte Blanche Quebec Award, Expusine Alternative Press Award, the Dot Award for Digital Literature, and the New Media Writing Prize. Her debut poetry collection, An Ocean of Static, was highly commended for the Forward Prizes 2018. Her latest collection, This is a Picture of Wind, is based on a web app by the same name. She is a fellow of the ECHO Center for North American Studies at the British Library and the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. She is currently the writer in residence at the University of Alberta from September 2020 to May 2021. And you can find all about her work and her work at luckysoap.com. Thank you, JR.
Thank you.
Let's
So
begin with some questions.
let's begin with some really hard questions. Let's see. We were briefly before we started recording talking about how you are in the middle of the wilderness with a river, how Élika has mountains around her, how I have this ocean. So let's think about the ocean, the clouds, the wind, these huge natural elements that are so central in your work, and how you treat them, because there's a sense of a hint of a cultural history or cultural fantasies, as you call them in the Gathering Cloud. Why is it important to you to look at natural elements from a cultural, historical perspective?
Yeah, start with a big question. I think there's a number of sort of layers to the answer of that. I grew up in the countryside. I grew up on a farm in Nova Scotia in a farming and fishing community. So I grew up in the countryside, and but I'm first generation Canadian, so I was born in Nova Scotia, but my parents were both immigrants, and I spent all my summers in New York City with my grandmother, who lived in a high rise in Queens. So from all my life, I had a very stark awareness of this kind of contrast, that nature didn't exist alone in nature, and that the very dense urban New York, cultural life that I lived in the summers was also an island in isolation, and I think that really formed me. That most people grow up in one or the other, and maybe have holidays or something. But for me, it was living in these two realities. So I can never really take either in isolation. Very informed by having been, I've been a migrant all my life, and it's been layers of trying to understand what that means, especially for a white English speaking person. It's really complicated to figure out the degree of your, on the one hand, your privilege, and on the other hand, your displacement. It's, it's really important work that needs to be done, especially in relation to settler colonialism. So I'm always trying to look at these sort of underpinning, these underlying aspects of something like nature, or something like the urban, because I have a fair few works about cities as well, and in the cities I'm always trying to find you know, there's often details of plants and animals and other ways of looking and mapping. And so, you know, I'm kind of trying to apply this critical reading to both urban and rural settings.
Excellent. I guess the second question, you know, builds up on that, and I'm thinking particularly in the gathering cloud, where you do an investigation and perhaps even a deconstruction of the metaphors and the popular held beliefs about the cloud, both the internet cloud, but also the actual clouds. This motif, this revelation of how the internet works, you know, what is the material basis for it, that works sometimes, you know, very levels of.
Your audio is a little choppy.
In digital arts, in digital literature.
Élika, see, we lost her in the cloud.
Should I?
She's gone. She's floating around.
Yeah, I think I'm freezing. Am I back?
I think so.
No, your image is frozen for me. Okay, you're back. You're back.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've been having trouble with my internet. We had a snowstorm a couple of days ago, and something's been happening since then. Yeah, exactly. How relevant.
Perfect. Let me talk about the materiality of the.
So where was I? Where did I cut?
Clouds interrupting the digital cloud.
Exactly. What was the last? Should I repeat the whole thing?
Repeat that question. Yeah.
Okay. So in the gathering cloud, you investigate and to a certain extent deconstruct to the metaphor and the popular held beliefs about the cloud, both the internet and the actual ones. And this revelation of how the internet works, what's the material substrate for it, which usually works, you know, through metaphor and good levels of deceit, have become and literature, animal that has a lot of that too. What would you use for users, you know, all around? Why is digital art so invested in it?
So you were a little bit choppy there in that question, so I'm going to try to guess what your question was. But I think what you're asking is why digital culture is so invested in some of these deceits around the idea of the cloud being ephemeral. Yeah, is that what you're asking?
In exposing them, yes, yeah. In exposing them.
Around also why the urgency to let users know this.
Yeah, so there are a lot of things there around, you know, there's a long history of consuming and controlling nature, and it hasn't done us any good, you know. So that there's a lot of stuff around trying to suppress our contact with the natural world, suppress our understanding of it, and that's wrapped up in settler colonialism and corporate, you know, corporate interests, capitalism, right? So in order for us to live this consumer lifestyle that we live, we need, you know, people need to not really think very much about the impact of, and this is everything from waste, you know, digital waste, but also just, you know, food waste, all of these things. It's really not great for the economy if people start thinking about the vast amount of waste.
Right.
When we think about the internet, I mean, we're reliant on it as part of society. We need it. we're in it right now. And so I think there's a genuine kind of difficulty of how do you reconcile, using something that does have quite an environmental impact. And there are a lot of people saying right now, oh, well, yeah, but Zoom is better than all the driving to work thing. And yeah, that's true, but we still have to critically interrogate how much energy is being used by cloud storage and streaming services like this, and also things around privacy. So there's that kind of, intellectual critique of consumer capitalism. But for me, what I'm really interested in is this other aspect of your question, which is almost more essential, of like how have we become so separated from nature? And when I was trying to think about cloud storage and thinking, okay, well, first of all, how do you make it interesting? How do you make it poetic? How do you make it something that anybody wants to hear about? But also, how do we think about things that we don't know how to think about? I mean, we have to start somewhere. And I think environmental issues in general face that problem of them being so massive that most people are just like, I
can't go there.
Can't go there, too much. I'm going to ignore it. And we can't ignore it, but we can't become overwhelmed about it. So part of my strategy is to make something small then. Okay, so we can't deal with the whole thing. We'll deal with this small thing. And also trying to, so if we can't think about this big thing, because we don't understand it, it's very new, it's mysterious, there's not a lot of oversight, these tech companies aren't scrutinized. Turning to the material clouds in the sky was an interesting way to create an analogy, because it was surprising to me how recently we didn't understand anything about the clouds in the sky. So the Gathering Cloud uses found text from essay by Luke Howard on the modification of clouds, which was first presented as a public lecture in 1802. It's pretty recent, really. And he's the man who named the clouds the names we use today: cumulus, stratus, nimbus. So by turning to an earlier epoch, a kind of early modern science, and also an era of increasing industrialization and the sort of formalization of science, sciences like meteorology, how by looking at that period and the rapid change that was going on in that period, how can we understand something about where we're at now? So these two strategies, right? If we have this thing that's too big to think about, let's find another thing that's too big to think about and smash them together and see what falls out. But also that what I'm making, that I take what falls out and I make a quite small thing. I make a gesture. The Gathering Cloud as a web piece is it's very simple. It's not, I didn't require a developer, or it's a small thing. And sometimes there's a zine version, and even the book thing. These are small, accessible, approachable points of entry into. Oh, do you have the zine? Fantastic. I'm trying to offer a point of entry, an opening into, rather than something that's going to overwhelm and repel.
Yeah, and if I can elaborate, okay.
I didn't touch anything.
Today is the day of tech. It's the day of tech failure today. Just to elaborate a little bit on that, I always think about how you're talking about gestures and how um, with text that is combining and that is shifting in the pieces. Um, it never is the point or the center of things like not the gathering cloud. This is a picture of wind, um, or the various pieces in an ocean of static, but they work as precisely as gestures. So it's not like the whole work is a combinatorial poetics kind of thing. It's really just like the little gestures that uses that kind of shifting, that kind of change and fluctuations, and what a great parallel it does with well the changes of nature, naturally the changes in wind, in currents and whatnot, but also with climate change.
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me with the web and with these sort of more fluid structures of writing is that you can invite people to participate in reading by making you kind of invite them, but also force them a little bit to make their own associations. So whereas, in a novel, you're sort of driving, and there can be a lot of ambiguity in a novel, but in a kind of digital format where there's even the space between the image and text, for example, what does the reader insert of their own into that space? So when I'm talking about a gesture of invitation, it's creating these kind of spaces. And the text itself doesn't always have this fixed authorial kind of this is exactly what I mean. It's more like a pointer, as you're saying, to often a wider text or a wider set of thinking. And almost all of my work in recent years has had a bibliography of some kind, and I really just want people to go do some reading on this subject. I want to get them interested enough in the subject that they continue to learn on their own.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of creating a space and also how to work with that space or represent space is something that we've been thinking a lot about in the past, and how to move through the space and have the space, and it has to do with how we've been thinking about the relationship between humans and the earth, but also looking at trying to have different figures of thought or conceptual models to understand this relationship that we have also with the other sort of great modern binaries like nature and technology, for example, and how they play out in climate change. So something that we discussed in a couple of weeks ago, actually with Jason Moore, you mentioned the capitalist scene before, and we were talking with him about, well, these topics in relation to the Industrial Revolution. And something that he said that really stuck with me was something about how the key technology about like WhatsApp is like, I need to close some stuff. It's like, okay. So the key technology or the key revolution, let's say, with the rise of the capital world ecology was not something big like the steam engine, but perhaps the map. And of course, we need to think the map as a technology that, of course, we can place, obviously, centuries and centuries back before the early modern period, as something that is interesting in how first it evolves as perhaps paper or other fixed materials, and perhaps there is something there about the reliability or the in the stasis as was fixed in a map of a territory, but also then how those maps have been evolving into something that gets constantly updated with satellite updates, and it's a changing technology that has big information modifying something that we carry in our pockets.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting tension in the evolution of this technology, which is probably the representation technology par excellence of the world, from print to digital. And this relationship also between both media is central to your work. So this has been a jumble question, I know. So, but can you tell us about the relation between print and digital maps? in your work?
Yeah, I mean, so mapping is something that, you know, I've had maps in my work since very, very, very early on. Mythologies of Landforms and Little Girls, 1996. The main interface is a map. And in that case, you know, it's an image of a map. You know, as a migrant, as somebody who grew up in a different country than everyone I'm related to, maps are this kind of conceptual representation of a place that, you know, especially if that place isn't fully internalized to you. So I've been interested in maps for a really, really, really long time, and I think. And you know, I did a lot of early work with the Google Maps API and stuff. But in recent work, I have a visual essay on the digital review that sort of ties together a lot of the earlier thinking with the current thinking around exactly what you're talking about this, you know, what underpins these maps. And so it's when you really start to understand the measurement behind the map. So the map itself is a bit of a red herring. It's not about the map. It's about the organizational principles of the map. So for example, the Mercator projection, late 16th century, you know, Mercator barely left home. He wrote a lot of letters, and people wrote him letters, and so there was this mode of collecting, and again, it's very tied into imperialism and ships. Right, the world, like I've given a number of talks that have titles like "The Internet is made of ships." I really want to drive home this idea that what we think of as the digital internet has a much longer history and a very oceanic history. So it doesn't start with the map. The map is the trace of an imperial endeavor. Right, and how do you conquer the world without knowing exactly where it is? So it's this imperial measure of trying to measure the earth so that we can colonize it and own it. Measurement of longitude and latitude, measurement of time, the massive investment that went into developing horology, clocks, you know, specific clocks to be able to measure longitude as ships were moving around the earth. You know, there's this off-cited idea that Columbus set off with such bravado, in part because he believed that the Atlantic was much smaller because of a mathematical error in the Ptolemaic maps of the time, right? So the profound impact of not the maps, but the measurement behind the maps. So Mercator projection famously makes you know, Europe look much larger and Africa look much smaller, and a lot of people critique this in a kind of, again, in a colonial Eurocentric sort of way. But the reason why that's the case is because, you know, in the North Atlantic, which was this key trade route, you know, the earth is curved. So how do you send a ship in a straight line across a curved ocean? It's called the circle line. And so the mathematics underpinning the Mercator projection are designed to keep ships on course so that we can conquer the world, right? And the Mercator projection underpins Google Maps. Google Maps is based on a Mercator projection. So as you say, you know, we're walking around with these maps in our pockets, but they're made of ships. They're made by ships, and they're made by ships that are sailing on, you know, imperial, colonial missions, right? So the circulation of people, enslaved or otherwise, and goods around the world is what's part of what's underpinning these current digital maps. And so this is a kind of thing that I feel, you know, everybody has different focuses and different approaches, but for me, I'm kind of constantly returning to, okay, but there's a physical earth under these
Yes.
things, right? Like that's the physical material properties of that we live on a round planet are underpinning technologies like Google Maps that we use every day. How can an awareness of that help bridge some of the cognitive dissonance that we experience in this world where we, you know, we don't even know where we're walking anymore without that thing, and so on. How can some kind of awareness of that's connected to a very long and physical and material tradition?
And the very idea of measurability too, which is something that I really loved in this is a picture of wind, where you have the Beaufort poems. Beaufort being, you know, was he the first one to come up with a scale to measure wind?
No, and so
not the first. Okay, so tell us about that.
Wind trivia.
The thing
Wind,
about you know, don't get me started on naval history because I'll bore you to death. So Francis Beaufort was he became the head of the British Admiralty, and the Beaufort wind scale has his name not because he invented it. It was like many things, and it was invented by many people. There was a version for windmills on land. There were a number of versions. Dalrymple created a version, and the thing is that Beaufort just made everyone use it. Right. So he understood that the British Empire was being built by wind, that wind is powering these ships that are going around the world. And he required all ships to keep logs. So every 4 hours, every ship in the British Navy and Merchant Marine is recording the wind everywhere around the world. And all that data is sitting in the supercomputer at the Met Office in Exeter in the United Kingdom. And that computer is currently the second largest supercomputer in the UK.
Wow.
So the the data collection, you know, that's the data collection, but also the measuring. I mean, this is a thing I talk about a lot in my most recent web-based work, The Pleasure of the Coast, is using archives of a French voyage by that was led by the Captain d'Entrecasteaux, but I'm looking at the archives of the hydrographer, and Francis Beaufort was also a hydrographer. So it's this age of hydrography, which is the practice of charting a coast from a ship. And it's an imperial practice. It's a colonizing practice, and that's how Francis Beaufort was trained. I was looking at the archives of Jean-François Beautemps-Beaupré, who became a sort of leading figure in French hydrography, but this was an early mission of his in the South Pacific, and Southern Australia and Tasmania, and the Solomon Islands. And how so I'm working with I was working with his sketches, which are held at the Archives Nationales in Paris, who are a partner on the project. And the sketches are kind of wonderful. They're artistic, they're fast, they're fluid, they're imprecise. They look imprecise, but they're Luke Howard, who studied the clouds in the early 1800s, which around the same time, because Beautemps-Beaupré sailed 1791. So watercolor was the only way to study the clouds. And again, Beautemps-Beaupré is using like liquid ink to make these fast moving kind of measurements. and so there's this real contrast between the seemingly artistic, fluid kind of representations that we could look at through the filter of an art world eye, but they're about they're toward a scientific exactitude that is pinning down, that's trying to measure these coasts to within an inch of their life. And these are coasts that have already been inhabited by indigenous people for, tens of thousands of years, right? So it's a gesture toward exactitude and measurement, but also ownership and also erasure of an indigenous knowledge of the spatiality of that coast.
Listening to you answer those questions, and we've completely gone off script for a while. Let's see if I can. Let's see if I can. This happens all the time. But it makes me think a lot about how you're talking about science and scientific models, just obviously as they are the simple representations of the world, in the same way that we do with a lot of artistic work, and also with stories. I mean, you've been telling a lot of stories about people discovering something and people then representing something about this person and this person. And I wonder also about the functions of maps, not just to think of them as representations of a natural world, but as they relate to the cartographer and the lived experiences of the person recording and the person representing. So how do you mix your own personal story, your memory? How do you knit this or intertwine it within these other stories that you're telling?
Yeah, that's an interesting question about the cartographer. I mean, like most people, for most of my life, I just I didn't interrogate the authorship of maps. And it was when I started doing my PhD, and I was spending a lot of time in the maps reading room at the British Library. So I had to leave Canada and go to England to see some of the earliest maps of this region that I grew up in Atlantic Canada, before it was Canada and before it was claimed by the British. So again, there's this kind of colonial thing where,
yes, of course.
And then I started to see, so first of all, Atlantic Canada, like Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, especially Newfoundland, they're just a jumble of islands. And, you start to think, oh, well, how did they get it so wrong? Oh, this is a view of the land from the ship. So already there's this ontological shift, because most of us grow up on the land, which stays still. And then you have to get your head into thinking, oh, what is a map from a ship that's constantly moving in the medium of the ocean, which is constantly moving. And then I was very interested in toponymy, the study of place names. I had a major sort of ontological shift when I moved to England, and a lot of the place names that I grew up with were English names. So suddenly I was living near Dartmouth, and there's a Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and there's a Truro, Nova Scotia, and a Falmouth, Nova Scotia, and all of these things. And that was a real eye opener for me. Obviously, I knew that those were English names, but there's something quite almost physical about realizing that you've grown up in a place where names have just been imposed by an imperial. So in order to understand some of these things about imperialism and settler colonialism, you really have to be dislodged from it. And for me, that was going to the place where those names had come from, and realizing something about the violence with which they had been, like imposed physically on these places. And I became really interested in, one of my strategies for decolonization is to be bilingual, right? And so to read in English and French, you start to see, okay, so the English project starts to fall apart when you realize that the French have their own narrative of the thing. So you see these two colonial powers are equally they're creating equally fictitious ideas of a place. So I started looking at Samuel de Champlain, who did a lot of, he was a cartographer, and he made a lot of early maps of New France and again, regions where I grew up and where I lived. So a number of things struck me, one of which was that there were a lot of indigenous names on those maps. The French dealt with indigenous peoples very differently than the English, not better, just differently. But then also, and more lately, and in this essay on the digital review, the Mapping Place Troubling Space essay, really trying to think through the violence of Champlain's mapping. So Champlain's, we can think of him as a cartographer, like as an author, but he worked for the fur company. Yeah. So his entire mission was to learn and appropriate indigenous trade routes, indigenous technologies, the canoe. The canoe is an indigenous technology, to appropriate indigenous bodies, both human bodies in the fur trade, but also the body of indigenous animals. So the beaver. So all these maps of Samuel de Champlain, you know, I'm describing a sort of re-education process that I went through, where I started to see them not as artifacts or as images, but as tools, as instruments for a really very vicious and deadly trade. And you know, the reason why the French were in North America after beaver pelts was because the beaver had already been hunted to extinction in Northern Europe, right? So this whole project of settler colonialism is predicated on species collapse, right? And so, you know, it took me a long time to sift down through all of that. And I guess in my work, I'm trying to think about how I can approach some of these things, bring some of these things to the fore, so that, you know, these very, very long held assumptions of people who grow up in settler colonialism can be dislodged slightly.
That's great. I didn't know that about the beavers. That comes as a shocking revelation to me right now.
Poor
but
beavers.
Fascinating. I know. Okay, going a little bit back to the script, I wanted to ask you a question about your use of digital and print media, in part because, as you know, that's something that I've been working on for the last few years. Yeah, I'm thinking like, oh, how long? A long time. So, you know, your most recent works, The Gathering Cloud, this is some of your most recent works, The Gathering Cloud, this is a picture of wind, and a little bit differently too, but similar, An Ocean of Static, have these two lives, the digital and the print. And of course, you've also shown them in a variety of galleries as well. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about your treatment of each medium. And of course, there's medium in digital and print and museum, but there's also medium in, you know, clouds, ocean, wind, etc. And how you treat them to underscore specific ways of meaning making and making these interventions that you've been discussing, as well as to participate in various media realms, market realms, physical spaces that have at the same time different dynamics of production, both creative but also obviously material, in the general sense.
Yeah, so I've always worked between, I would say. My background was in visual art, was in studio art, and I had a very physical kind of practice and a concentration in fibers and sculpture, and having come through drawing and very, you know, like, so I have this very physical material way of thinking and working. I started, you know, I was making zines and small things. Was one of the first ways I was trying to.
I have some of them here.
Marvelous. So I was trying to, so before any thought of trying to bridge the physical and the digital, I mean, before I even encountered the digital, my real concern, my initial concern was trying to bridge image and text. Because I was in a very visual art world, but I was, you know, I was a writer stuck in a visual artist's body. I'm still about that. I have a dysphoria around that. Well, and so I was embroidering text. I was crocheting text. You know, I was trying to write, but through these very cumbersome media. And I started making zines. I had a job where there was a photocopy machine, and I was secretly, like, although painfully obvious to everybody, abusing this photocopy machine. And so when the web really became accessible in 1995 or so, it was a relief, because it was so much easier to do a lot of the things that I was trying to do. And it was in a zine way. It was really lo-fi. It was quite simple. You didn't need permission. You could just, and so I wasn't thinking about the digital as a technology that I wanted to explore. I was already well on the route of my own exploration, and I really didn't care about whether it was in paper or cloth or the digital. So that exploration was something to do with this ultraspace, the space between image and text. And of course, once I started using the web more as a medium, the web allowed me to do things that the physical limitation of the book, not just as a material like paper, but as a reading convention. So the first web-based work I made was almost exactly 25 years ago, here in Alberta at the Banff Center, further south than where I am now. And I was trying to make a zine that told a circular story. But when everybody got to the last page, they just stopped reading, because that's how books work. So that's a conceptual limitation that we have ingrained in our brains. And somebody said, oh, well, if you made this in HTML, you could link the last page to the first page, and the story could go around and around. That's genius. So, and then, you know, now, so many of my web projects have some kind of zine version. Entreville has a zine, the Cape has a zine, you know, and that started because I was making zines anyway, and why not? And you know, the images are similar. Those projects like Entreville, they're basically collage. It's all collage at the end of the day. But but it was also a kind of moment of, I mean, zines are pretty big in Montreal, and there was a culture of zines. There was this guy, Louis Ristilli, who bought up old cigarette machines and repurposed them to sell art that was the size of a cigarette pack for $2. So I had zines in those things. So there was a commodity, you know, there was a way of exchanging them, but also it was, they became a kind of site of exchange. You know, if you meet somebody on the street or in a cafe or at a book launch, you can't just, like, show them your website right there. So it became a way to physically, because all of the zines have a URL on the back. So it was a physical link, but also, that exchange between people. And then in the larger, in recent works, honestly, with the Gathering Cloud, it was commissioned by a media art festival, and media art has big materials budgets, and I was making a web-based work, and I wanted to use the material budget, and so I was like, great, we'll do color. And the Gathering Cloud zine that Élika, that Alex has behind her, and so again, though, so this zine had a higher production value than some of the earlier ones, just because of that budget context. And I also used part of my materials budget on stamps, and I sent it out a lot, and it was because of that intermediary form and quite transitory form that I was able to. So I sent a zine to the publisher, who then published the print book. So they're cousins, but and there's another form that you didn't mention, which is the critical essay. So I mean, I have a PhD. I write critically. I actually came to writing through writing critical essays. I started writing art reviews when I was in art school. So I was a critic before any of this, and it's not, it's less widely known, but I came to writing through a kind of critical writing, and I write critically about my own work, but about situating my work. So I make the work, and then I try to understand what the heck I've done. And so the Gathering Cloud was really the first instance of, like, as soon as I made the text, as soon as I made the web-based piece, I knew that I was going to be writing about it, and that I was going to be putting it into a larger critical context. That I get invitations to do talks and often keynotes, which are a really interesting creative form, because you have more time, so you have time, and you have slides behind you. So again, there's that image text thing. So if I'm going to write an essay, why not write a book? And that the criticality component is something that's sort of missing, I think, in the dialogue between. It's one of the important links between the print and the digital for me.
Right.
A Notion of Static is actually Appendix C of my PhD thesis. I mean, plus ou moins, because there's a few things in here that weren't in that, and there's a few types. But Appendix C was print iterations of web-based scripts for live performance. So a better title.
Yes.
But it was, again, this kind of criticality. It was because I was engaged in this critical process that made me, it was that process that made me even capture these ephemeral things. A print iteration of a web-based script for live performance, that took some time just to capture it. And so that's stuff that I think that, kind of gets a little bit lost in the discussions that I wind up having about print and digital. So I wanted to mention all that. Right. And then there's just the more basic thing of, these different, and this is what you're alluding to, Élika, is that these different formats, in addition to presenting the work differently, they reach different audiences. And so, I've never studied poetry a day in my life. I've never studied English literature. This writer in residence that I'm doing right now is in the Department of English and Film Studies at the University of Alberta, and it's the first time I've been associated with an English department, and you know, and they're delighted and delighted, and it's all fine, you know. But I felt I should warn them about that, and so I'm coming from all kinds of other disciplinary backgrounds. Obviously, I've read a massive amount of poetry and spent, you know, been in poetry contexts for years, but I don't come from that traditional English lit major kind of background. But this book is published by a poetry press, and it's being published. It was published as poetry and presented to a poetry community. So then all kinds of people who, you know about poetry and live and breathe poetry are writing about it as poetry. So I learned a lot about poetry in the process of reading the reviews. I had to look up a lot of terms that were used in the reviews. It's really just about learning at the end of the day. I'm trying to learn about things by making work. I'm trying to learn about the work that I've made, and then I'm trying to put the work in front of other people who know different things so that they can tell me what they understand about the work.
Yeah, I think this is, yeah, and I think this is, thank you for that turn in that answer, because it's a perfect way to end this conversation, and just to reflect on something that I guess I'm very happy that you said this about the importance of critical work and, you know, the research, because, you know, this conversation is also part of this class that we're teaching, and it is a PhD or master's / well, it's a graduate class for people, and the students that are enrolled are mostly in literature departments, Complit and things like that. But what we're asking them to do is a bunch of creative work, and the final project it's a piece of creative work. And we want them to ask scholarly questions and reflect through all the critical readings that we're doing. And we're going to ask them to write a sort of critical statement.
A critical piece.
Because I think that the part of how creativity allows you to learn different things, how the imagination figures things differently, and then that allows you to reflect in a different way, critically, scholarly, academically, on the world, is so important. So I'm so happy to see this, which we knew was always at play in your work, but to be such a central part of your thinking. It's really
yeah. I mean, my PhD was a practice-led PhD, which is the term used in the UK, but there's different sort of variations on that term and I do a lot of sort of master class type, you know, talks around practice-led research. Even people who are doing practice-led research, and even people who are supervising practice-led PhDs, it still remains a kind of elusive balance to a lot of people. But for me, it's just makes absolute total intrinsic sense, and it's part of a critical engagement with the world that I feel that I had before it was formalized in this way. And one thing I'd say about my attraction to these kind of moments in earlier in science is that it feels like people like Luke Howard and Darwin, but also, these sort of Victorian ladies who are collecting samples of seaweed. And I'm reading about this young woman in Lyme Regis who collected dinosaur fossils. And it seemed like then practice-led research made a lot of sense, and you had to be a watercolorist, and you had to be a writer, and you had to get out in the field, and you had to, and so a lot of the reason why I evoke these works, these historical works, or return to these earlier moments, like in The Pleasure of the Coast with Bertrand Beaupré, is, he had to be all of those things. He had to be a scientist, he had to be an artist, he had to be a technical writer. And I kind of want more of that, please.
Definitely, yeah. And I mean, that would take us into disciplinary, conversation that is, that, I mean, for just, to speak of my trajectory, and I think Alex has a similar one, trained as literary scholars, like just moving on to the study of digital literatures, open up that door. And what this class is doing is precisely trying to bring that into further, into the foreground, really, to talk about matter and, media as matter. And that's why, yeah.
The visual, because there's such a strong visual element in digital text, for example, I mean, anybody who's seriously studying digital literature at a doctoral level really should know a little bit about art history. I mean, we need. I argued about for this in my thesis that there needs to be a more incorporated understanding of visual culture, and so the Gathering Cloud gets into all kinds of aspects of book history and image making, and it's something that hasn't been part really of or enough of a part of. So enough of a part of digital literature. And so, I'm advocating for a kind of multidisciplinarity that is very difficult to achieve in institutions that have, very complex
departments and programs.
Yeah. But if there are any PhD students listening at all, my parting advice, warning, reminder is that it's just a PhD. I mean, it's only a few years, and then the work. It's a false these are false categories, and the work. The work at the end of the day can and must combine all of these different knowledges and incorporate these different traditions. There's no reason to stay within those boundaries once you get out of your whatever department you're in. Even if you're working in one program, if you go on and you have a job in one program, there's no reason. I'm so grateful to this English department that is hosting me here right now, because they, I formally asked them, can I talk to students in other departments? And they were like, of course you can. Of course you can. So I get to talk to visual art students and media art, and I was invited to talk to some department I didn't even know the name of and now can't remember. And I'm thinking, wow, social geography or something. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I do. So
yeah.
All right, and on that,
well, thank you so much, JR.
Thank you so much.
This was a great conversation. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.